He grabbed her arm and pulled her closer. His other hand held her waist tightly. "Don't fight it," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is how God's blessings will come to you. Trust me." Ada froze. Her body trembled as she tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. Tears filled her eyes, but she couldn't cry out. Who would even listen to her? "I'm your spiritual father," Pastor Emmanuel said, his face calm, as if he truly believed his own words. "What I'm doing is for your good." Ada wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. Her mother had sent her to him, saying he was a man of God, saying he would pray for her and help her life get better. Now, here she was, trapped, with no one to save her. The House of Divine Miracles was the biggest church in the city. Its white walls and tall cross could be seen from far away. People came from everywhere to attend services. Some came for prayers, others for miracles, but most came to see Pastor Emmanuel, the famous preacher everyone called Daddy Miracles. Every Sunday, the church was packed. The streets outside were crowded with cars, buses, and people selling religious items. Inside, the seats were full, and some people even stood at the back just to hear him speak. Pastor Emmanuel was not like other pastors. He wore expensive suits and shiny shoes. He had a deep voice that made people stop and listen. His words were full of promises, healing, blessings, and wealth. When he prayed for people, they said they felt different, like something had changed in their lives. Ada's parents, Grace and John, were some of his most loyal followers. They never missed a service. They sat close to the front, hanging on to every word he said. They believed he could solve any problem. "Did you hear what he said today?" Grace asked her husband after one service. "He prayed for a woman last week, and now her business is doing well. That's the power of God working through him." "Yes," John agreed. "We are blessed to have him as our pastor." Ada sat quietly beside them. She didn't believe in the miracles. She didn't feel the excitement her parents felt. Every Sunday, she sat through the long services, wishing she was anywhere else. But her parents didn't care about what she wanted. Her mother often scolded her. "Why don't you pay attention?" she asked one day after church. "Pastor Emmanuel is a man of God. You're too stubborn. You need prayers." Ada didn't argue. She knew her mother wouldn't listen. She didn't like how much power the pastor had over her family, but she kept her thoughts to herself. One Sunday after church, Pastor Emmanuel stopped Ida's mother. "I've been praying, and God has revealed something to me about your daughter," he said, with a warm smile. Grace's eyes lit up. "Oh, Pastor, thank you. I've been worried about her. She's always quiet and doesn't seem interested in the things of God." "Don't worry," he said, nodding. "She's special. God has a plan for her life. Bring her for a private prayer session, and I will guide her spiritually." Grace was overjoyed. That same week, she dragged Ada to the church. Ada didn't want to go, but her mother wouldn't take no for an answer. "You will thank me later," Grace said, as they walked into the church. Pastor Emmanuel welcomed them with his usual smile. "Welcome, my child," he said, looking at Ada. "Let us pray." Grace left the room, saying, "I'll wait outside. Pastor knows what's best." At first, the prayer seemed normal. He prayed over her, asking for God's blessings. But soon, things changed. His hands moved to her shoulders, then her waist. Ada tried to step back, but he held her firmly. "You must trust me," he said, his voice calm. "God works in mysterious ways." Ada's heart raced. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to shout for her mother, but fear kept her silent. The private prayer sessions became more frequent. Pastor Emmanuel would always start the same way. calm, soothing prayers that made it seem like nothing was wrong. But slowly, his actions would change. His hands would linger too long on her shoulders. His touch would move to places it shouldn't. His words would twist scriptures into something unrecognizable. "You are chosen, Ada," he would whisper. "God has a great plan for you. I am here to help you fulfill it." At first, Ada tried to resist. She would pull away or step back, but Pastor Emmanuel always found a way to corner her. "Do not fight me," he would say, his voice stern but gentle enough to sound convincing. "This is part of God's work. You must trust me." She wanted to tell her mother, but how could she? Her mother worshipped him as if he were God himself. Whenever Ada tried to hint at her discomfort, her mother would brush it aside. "You should be grateful Pastor Emmanuel is taking time to pray for you," she'd say. "You need spiritual guidance." Ada's father wasn't any better. He was always busy with work, leaving most of the decisions about church and faith to Grace. Even if he were around, Ada doubted he would believe her. Pastor Emmanuel had a way of making Ada feel small and powerless. He told her that her doubts were a sign of weakness. "The devil is trying to confuse you," he said one day, after she pulled away from his touch. "If you don't obey, you are letting the enemy win." Each time she resisted, he made her feel guilty. "God sees everything," he said during one session. "If you disobey me, you are disobeying him. Do you want to anger God?" The words echoed in her mind long after the sessions ended. She felt dirty, ashamed, and confused. Was she really doing something wrong? Was God angry at her? Pastor Emmanuel's grip on her wasn't just physical, it was emotional and spiritual. He convinced her that her silence was part of God's plan. "You must not tell anyone about these sessions," he warned. "People won't understand. They will try to destroy what God is building in you." Ada's world began to shrink. She stopped smiling, stopped looking people in the eye. At school, she couldn't concentrate. Her grades began to slip, and her teachers noticed, but no one asked why. At home, her parents were too busy praising Pastor Emmanuel to see what was happening to their daughter. The only person who noticed was her best friend, Amara. One afternoon, they sat on the steps outside their apartment building. Amara nudged her. "You've been so quiet lately. What's going on?" Ada hesitated. She wanted to tell Amara everything, but the pastor's words haunted her. "If you speak, you will bring shame to your family," he had said. "Do you want to ruin your parents' reputation?" "I'm just tired," Ada said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Amara didn't look convinced. "Tired of what?" "You can tell me, Ada. I'm your friend." Ada shook her head. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Each day felt heavier than the last. At night she cried into her pillow, wishing she could disappear. She felt trapped, like she was screaming into a void where no one could hear her. One evening, Ada opened the notepad app on her phone. It wasn't much, but it felt like the only safe place she could speak freely. She started writing everything down. The things Pastor Emmanuel said, the way he touched her, how he made her feel. "Today, he said I am special, but I don't feel special. I feel broken. Why won't my parents believe me? Why does everyone think he's perfect? He's not. He's a monster." Her entries were raw and unfiltered. She wrote about the guilt, the fear, the loneliness. She wrote about wanting to run away but having nowhere to go. Her phone became her lifeline, a silent witness to her pain. The pressure began to take its toll. Ada started skipping meals. She stayed in her room as much as possible, avoiding her parents and their endless talk about the church. She couldn't sleep. When she did, Nightmares of the pastor's face jolted her awake. At school, her classmates whispered about how different she seemed. "What's wrong with her?" they asked. "She looks like she's seen a ghost." But no one really asked. No one really cared. Ada felt invisible. Her parents noticed her behavior, but misunderstood it. "You need more prayers," her mother said one evening after Ada refused to eat. "I'll speak to Pastor Emmanuel about setting up another session." "No," Ada shouted, surprising herself. It was the first time she had raised her voice. Her mother glared at her. "What has gotten into you? You're behaving like someone who doesn't know God." Ada didn't respond. She couldn't. She felt like a stranger in her own home. In Ada's community, pastors were seen as untouchable. They were men of God, chosen to lead and guide. Questioning a pastor was seen as questioning God himself. Victims like Ada had no voice because society refused to believe men like Pastor Emmanuel could do any wrong. The women in the church often talked about how blessed they were to have Pastor Emmanuel as their leader. "He's a man of integrity," one woman said during a prayer meeting. "He would never harm anyone." Ada wanted to scream every time she heard those words. But what could she do? Even if she told someone, would they believe her? Would they help her? Or would they turn against her? The weeks passed, and Ada grew weaker from the emotional and physical strain. When she realized she was pregnant, fear took hold of her. She hid it from her parents, knowing they would only send her back to Pastor Emmanuel for more prayers. She dreaded his reaction, but she had no choice but to tell him. When she finally did, his reaction was cold and dismissive. "You can't let this ruin everything," he said, his face devoid of compassion. "Do you know what this would do to the church? To me?" He handed her a small bottle of liquid. "Drink this," he said. "It will make everything go away." Ada hesitated but ultimately did as he said. The pain started that night, sharp cramps and a heavy flow of blood. She endured it alone, afraid to call for help. Her parents were away, as they often were, and when they returned 3 days later, they found her lifeless body. Ada's death shocked Grace and John to their core. Grace wept uncontrollably, holding her daughter's cold hand. John stood in silence, unable to process what had happened. The doctor's vague report mentioned complications from a miscarriage, but provided no clear answers. After the burial, Grace couldn't bring herself to touch Ada's belongings. One day, as she sat on Ada's bed, crying softly, she found Ada's phone tucked under the pillow. She hesitated before unlocking it, scrolling through the apps until she saw the notepad icon. What she read shattered her. The entries detailed everything: Pastor Emmanuel's manipulations, the abuse, and the final bottle he gave her to drink. Grace gasped, dropping the phone. "John," she called, her voice shaking. John came running, and Grace handed him the phone without a word. As he read, his face darkened with anger and guilt. How could we let this happen?" he whispered. They sat in silence, their world crumbling around them. The man they had trusted, the man they had worshipped, was responsible for their daughter's death. Ada's life ended in tragedy after she fell victim to Pastor Emmanuel's manipulation and abuse. Sent to him for prayers and spiritual guidance, Ada endured emotional and physical torment in silence. Her cries for help were unheard, her parents blinded by their trust in the pastor. When she discovered she was pregnant, Pastor Emmanuel gave her a bottle of liquid, insisting it would solve her problem. The substance cost her life, leaving her parents, Grace and John, devastated. After Ada's death, Grace discovered her daughter's secret notes, which revealed the pastor's evil deeds. The revelation shattered their world. Yet, despite their anger and guilt, they were too afraid to confront him, knowing his influence and power in the church and community. But their silence allowed Pastor Emmanuel to continue targeting more young girls, as whispers of his deeds began to circulate among a few brave voices. Now, in part 2, Grace and John struggle with fear, guilt, and threats, while a new force begins to rise, one that could change everything. Grace stood in the kitchen, staring at the steaming cup of tea in her hands. The house was quiet, but her thoughts were loud. It had been weeks since she and John stopped going to church. Weeks since they last saw Pastor Emmanuel. But every day, the weight of guilt pressed harder on her chest. Her daughter was gone. Gone because of the man she had trusted, the man she had praised as a man of God. Grace's hands trembled as she thought of Ada's face, her eyes filled with a silent plea for help that Grace had been too blind to see. Grace, John's voice broke her thoughts. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his face lined with worry. He looked older now, the stress and guilt aging him in ways time never could. "You've been standing there for 10 minutes. Are you okay?" Grace shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not okay, John. I'll never be okay. We let him kill our daughter." John walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We didn't know. We trusted him, just like everyone else. But we should have known." Grace's voice cracked. "A mother should protect her child. I failed, John. I failed her." "We both did," John said softly. "But we can't change the past. All we can do now is survive." Grace nodded weakly, but in her heart, she didn't want to just survive. She wanted to do something, anything, to make up for what they had allowed to happen. At the House of Divine Miracles, Pastor Emmanuel stood before the congregation, his voice booming. "Beware of those who let the devil into their hearts," he declared, his eyes scanning the crowd. "There are people who have turned away from God. They spread lies and falsehoods to destroy his work, but the Lord will punish them in his time." The congregation murmured in agreement, their faces filled with awe and devotion. Pastor Emmanuel smiled inwardly. He knew Grace and John had stopped attending. He had noticed their absence and heard the whispers, but he also knew fear was a powerful tool. He would make sure they stayed silent. After the service, he called one of his loyal church members, a woman named Sister Deborah, into his office. "I need you to visit Grace and John," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Remind them of their commitment to God. Tell them I am praying for them." Sister Deborah nodded. "Yes, Pastor." As she left the office, Pastor Emmanuel leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. Grace and John would learn that no one could escape him. The knock on the door came late in the evening. Grace's heart raced as she exchanged a glance with John. He walked cautiously to the door and peered through the peephole. Seeing Sister Deborah, he sighed and opened it slightly. "Good evening, Brother John," Sister Deborah said with a forced smile. "I came to check on you and Sister Grace. The pastor has been worried about you." "We're fine," John replied curtly. "Tell the pastor not to worry." Sister Deborah tilted her head. "It's unusual for you to miss so many services. You know how important it is to stay connected to God's house." "We're taking some time for ourselves," John said, his voice firm. Sister Deborah's smile faltered. "I understand. But remember, the devil works hardest on those who isolate themselves. The pastor says you mustn't let fear or doubt pull you away from God." John nodded stiffly and closed the door. As the lock clicked into place, Grace exhaled shakily. "They're watching us," she whispered. "Let them watch," John said, but his eyes betrayed his own fear. The days dragged on uneasily for Grace and John. Every knock at the door made Grace's heart jump. She stopped opening the windows, afraid someone might see her inside. John became restless, pacing the living room every evening as if waiting for something bad to happen. One night, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, John broke the silence. "We can't keep living like this, Grace." Grace looked up from her hands. "What choice do we have? If we try to fight him, he'll destroy us." "He's already destroying us," John said bitterly. "We can't sleep. We can't breathe. We've lost everything." Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, but John was right. Ada's death had taken everything from them: peace, hope, even their faith. Now, the pastor's shadow loomed over their lives, refusing to let them move on. It was a quiet afternoon when the letter arrived. Grace found it on the doorstep, a plain white envelope with no name or return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with words scrawled in bold black ink. "You can't run from God's work. Don't make me come after you." Grace gasped and dropped the letter like it was on fire. "John," she called out, her voice shaking. John came rushing from the bedroom. "What is it?" She pointed to the letter on the floor, unable to speak. John picked it up and read it. His face darkened with anger. "That man, he's trying to scare us." Grace's voice wavered. "What if he means it? What if he comes after us?" John clenched his fist. "Let him try. I'll protect you." But Grace didn't feel safe. That night, she barely slept, flinching at every sound outside. The final straw came 2 nights later. They returned home from the market to find their living room window shattered. Inside, they found a rock on the floor with another note tied to it. This time it read, "This is your last warning. Obey God's will." Grace collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with fear. John paced the room, muttering angrily under his breath. "We can't stay here, Grace. It's not safe anymore." "Where will we go?" Grace asked, tears streaming down her face. "We have no one, John." "We'll figure it out," he said firmly, "but we can't let him control us like this." The next morning, they packed their belongings. Grace packed a small suitcase with clothes and some of Ada's things, her favorite scarf, a photo of her smiling at the beach, and her phone with the notes Grace had read over and over. They left before sunrise, taking a bus out of the city. Grace watched the familiar streets fade into the distance, her chest tight with a mix of fear and sadness. She didn't know where they were going or what they would do next. All she knew was that they had to survive. John held her hand tightly as they sat in silence. Neither of them spoke, but both felt the heavy weight of the past following them like a shadow. The bus ride was long and quiet. Grace stared out of the window, watching unfamiliar landscapes roll by. She clutched Ada's scarf in her lap, her fingers gripping the fabric tightly. Every so often, she glanced at John, whose eyes were fixed ahead, his jaw clenched. He hadn't spoken much since they left, but she could feel the storm of thoughts in his mind. "We'll find somewhere safe," he finally said, breaking the silence. "We'll start fresh." Grace nodded weakly. She wanted to believe him, but the fear in her heart wouldn't let go. "Do you think he'll come after us?" John didn't answer right away. He exhaled deeply, leaning his head back against the seat. "I don't know, Grace, but we can't live like prisoners anymore." They arrived in a small, quiet town, hours away from the city. It was a place where no one knew them, where they could disappear. The town was peaceful, with narrow streets lined with old houses, and a market square bustling with friendly faces. Grace and John rented a modest one-room apartment above a bakery. The space was small, but it felt like a haven compared to the suffocating fear they had left behind. For the first time in weeks, Grace slept without jumping at every sound, but peace was fleeting. The weight of Ada's death still clung to them. Grace spent her days sitting by the window, staring at nothing. She kept Ada's phone by her side, scrolling through her notes again and again. Each word felt like a dagger to her heart. John, meanwhile, threw himself into work, taking odd jobs around town to keep busy. He came home late every evening, exhausted and distant. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing day. Back in the city, Pastor Emmanuel sat in his office, staring at the empty pews of the church. His expression was cold, his mind racing. "Grace and John have left," Sister Deborah said hesitantly, standing in front of him. "Their house is empty." Pastor Emmanuel's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "Do you know where they went?" "No, Pastor," Sister Deborah replied, her voice trembling. "They didn't tell anyone." For the first time, a flicker of anger crossed his face. "They think they can run from me," he muttered under his breath. He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "I gave them everything, prayers, guidance, hope. And this is how they repay me?" Sister Deborah stayed silent, watching as the pastor's calm facade began to crack. "Find them," he ordered sharply. "I don't care how. I want to know where they are." "Yes, Pastor," Sister Deborah said, before hurrying out of the room. Grace was sitting by the window one afternoon when she noticed a young woman walking up the street. She was tall, with short, braided hair and a confident stride. Something about her felt different. She didn't look like someone from the town. The woman stopped at the bakery downstairs, speaking briefly to the shopkeeper before heading toward the staircase. Grace's heart began to race as footsteps echoed up the stairs. There was a knock at the door. Grace hesitated, glancing at John, who was sitting at the small table in the corner. "I'll get it," he said, standing up and walking to the door. He opened it cautiously. "Good afternoon," the woman said, her voice calm and steady. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to speak with you both. It's about Pastor Emmanuel." Grace froze. She exchanged a nervous glance with John before standing slowly. "Who are you?" John asked, his voice guarded. "My name is Amaka," the woman said, stepping forward slightly. "I know what he did to your daughter, and I think you know too." Grace's breath caught in her throat. How do you know about Ada?" Amaka gave them a small, sad smile. "Because I've been investigating Pastor Emmanuel for months. You're not the only ones he's hurt." Amaka stepped into the small apartment, her eyes scanning the modest room before settling on Grace and John. She could see the exhaustion on their faces, the weight of loss and fear that clung to them like a shadow. "Please," Grace said softly, motioning to the small couch. "Sit." Amaka nodded and took a seat. She placed her bag on the floor and folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm but serious. "I know this must feel unexpected," she began, "but I came here because I believe we share a common goal." John leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "What goal is that?" "To expose Pastor Emmanuel for what he truly is," Amaka said firmly. "To stop him from hurting anyone else." Grace's breath caught. She looked at John, her face pale. We can't do that. You don't understand what he's capable of." Amaka met Grace's eyes, I understand more than you think. I've spoken to other victims, young girls like your daughter Ada, girls who were manipulated and abused by him. Some are too scared to speak out, but their stories are the same. He's been doing this for years. Grace covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes welling with tears. Years. Amaka nodded. He targets vulnerable families, parents who trust him completely, girls who don't know how to fight back. He uses his position as a pastor to silence them, to make them feel like they're the ones doing something wrong. John's voice was tight with anger. And you think we can stop him? He's too powerful. The church worships him like he's God himself. That's why I'm here, Amaka said, her tone unwavering. I'm not just gathering stories, I'm gathering evidence, concrete proof of what he's done. But I need your help. Grace shook her head, her hands trembling. We can't. We've already lost so much. What if he comes after us again? He's already after you, Amaka said gently. But if you stay silent, he wins. Every day he's free, more girls are at risk. Grace looked down at Ada's scarf, still clutched in her lap. Tears dripped onto the fabric as she whispered. Couldn't protect her. I failed her. Amaka leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. But you can honor her. Ada's story can help others. You have something powerful. Her notes, her voice. It's not too late to fight for her. John's eyes narrowed. And what happens if we help you? What if it's not enough to stop him? Amaka reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder. She placed it on the table and opened it, revealing photographs and printed pages. This is what I've gathered so far, she said. Testimonies from other victims, screenshots of messages he sent, recordings of him twisting scripture to manipulate people. But I need more. Your daughter's story could be the piece that finally breaks his control. Grace and John stared at the folder. The evidence was damning. Pictures of girls, handwritten accounts, even a blurry recording of the pastor touching a girl's shoulder inappropriately during a prayer session. Grace reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder. She looked at Amaka, her voice trembling. If we help you, what happens next? We take this to the right people, Amaka said. The media, the authorities, anyone who will listen. But first, we need to be prepared. He's powerful, and he'll do everything he can to silence us. That's why it's important we work together. John hesitated. You don't know how dangerous he is. If he finds out, he won't, Amaka interrupted. Not if we're careful. I've been doing this for a long time. I know how to stay under the radar. Grace wiped her tears and straightened her back. If this can help stop him, if this can save another girl from what Ada went through. She paused, her voice breaking. Then I'll do it. I'll help you. John looked at her, his jaw tight. Grace, I've already lost my daughter, John, she said, her voice firm. I won't let her death be for nothing. John exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. Finally, he nodded. Fine. But if this goes wrong, it won't, Amaka said confidently. Amaka spent the rest of the afternoon going over the details with Grace and John. She asked Grace to share Ada's notes and any other evidence they might have. She also explained her next steps, gathering more testimonies, building a timeline of the pastor's actions, and preparing for the moment when they would expose him publicly. As night fell, Amaka stood to leave. Thank you, she said, looking at Grace and John. I know this isn't easy, but you're doing the right thing. Grace nodded, her grip on Ada's scarf tightening. Just promise me he'll pay for what he's done. Amaka's eyes hardened. He will. I'll make sure of it. Amaka left Grace and John's apartment that evening with Ada's notes tucked safely in her bag. She walked down the quiet street, her mind racing with plans. Grace and John's story was more powerful than anything she'd collected so far. With the right approach, it could expose Pastor Emmanuel for what he truly was. But it wouldn't be easy. As she turned a corner, she noticed a car parked across the street. The engine wasn't running, but the headlights flickered for a moment before going dark. Amaka paused, her instincts kicking in. Someone was watching her. She pulled her hood over her head and continued walking, pretending not to notice. Grace sat at the small table, staring at the empty spot where Amaka had laid the folder. Her mind replayed every word the young woman had said. "She's brave," Grace murmured. John, who was sitting by the window, glanced at her. "She's reckless," he muttered. "That pastor isn't just some preacher. He's dangerous." "She's doing what we couldn't," Grace said, her voice trembling. "She's standing up to him. If we don't help her, who will?" John sighed heavily. "I just want us to stay safe, Grace. I don't want to lose you too." Grace stood and walked over to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can't live in fear forever, John. If we don't fight back, he'll keep doing this to other families. We owe it to Ada." John nodded reluctantly. "I just hope we're ready for what's coming." Amaka spent the next week digging deeper. She reached out to victims she'd spoken to before, encouraging them to share their stories. Some were still too scared, but a few agreed to meet her in secret. One evening, she sat in a small cafe, speaking with a young girl named Eve. The girl was no older than 16, her hands trembling as she sipped a glass of water. "He told me it was part of God's plan," Eve whispered, her voice barely audible. "He said I should trust him, that it was a blessing." Amaka placed a comforting hand on hers. "You're not alone, Eve. What he did to you was wrong, and I promise we're going to stop him." Eve nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I want to help. I don't want anyone else to go through this." Amaka smiled gently. "Your courage means everything. Thank you." At the House of Divine Miracles, Pastor Emmanuel stood in his office, pacing back and forth. He could feel the tension in the air. "Someone is digging," he muttered to himself. "Someone is trying to ruin me." Sister Deborah entered the room, clutching a notebook. "Pastor, the rumors are growing. People are starting to talk. Some families are even questioning your private sessions." Pastor Emmanuel slammed his hand on the desk, making Sister Deborah flinch. "Silence them. Remind them who I am. Remind them of what I've done for this church." "Yes, Pastor," she said quickly. He leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "And find out who's behind this. I want names." One evening, as Grace and John sat in their apartment, a loud knock echoed through the room. Grace froze, her heart racing. "Who could it be?" she whispered. John stood cautiously, motioning for her to stay back. He approached the door and peered through the peephole. "It's empty," he said, confused. He opened the door slightly, and a folded piece of paper fell to the floor. John picked it up and opened it. The message was chilling. "We know where you are. Stop what you're doing, or you'll regret it." John's hands shook as he showed the note to Grace. Her face turned pale. "He's found us," she whispered, her voice breaking. John's jaw tightened. "We have to tell Amaka. She needs to know he's onto her too." John called Amaka immediately after reading the threatening note. His voice was low and steady, but Grace could hear the fear in it. "They know where we are," he said. "We found a note at the door." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Amaka's voice came through, calm but firm. "I'm on my way. Don't open the door for anyone else. Stay inside and keep the curtains closed." Grace sat at the table, her fingers gripping Ada's scarf tightly. "What if they come back?" she whispered after John hung up. "They won't," John said, though his voice was less confident than his words. When Amaka arrived, she was carrying a small bag slung over her shoulder. She stepped inside quickly, locking the door behind her. Her eyes darted around the room, checking for anything unusual. "Let me see the note," she said. John handed it to her. She unfolded the paper and read it carefully, her face unreadable. "This is his style," Amaka said. "Indirect threats, just enough to scare you into silence." She looked up at them. "But this means we're getting close. He's nervous." "Nervous?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. "This man knows where we live, Amaka. How are we supposed to feel safe?" Amaka knelt down in front of Grace, her expression softening. "I know this is terrifying, but if we back down now, he wins. Every time someone stays silent, he gets stronger. We can't let that happen." Grace swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm scared." "I know," Amaka said gently, "but you're not alone in this. I'm here, and there are others who want to see him stopped. We just have to be careful." Amaka pulled a laptop out of her bag and set it on the table. "We need to move quickly," she said. "The more evidence we have, the harder it will be for him to silence us. Grace, I'm going to digitize Ada's notes. Her words need to be preserved." Grace nodded slowly. "You think her story will be enough?" "It's more than enough," Amaka replied. "Her voice is powerful. It will connect with people. But we need to strengthen the case even more." She turned to John. "Do you remember anything suspicious from your time at the church? Anything that stood out to you about him or how he operates?" John hesitated, then nodded. "He was always secretive. He kept a small group of people close. People who'd do anything for him. They handled all the money, the schedules, everything." "That's good," Amaka said. "If we can find someone in that inner circle who's willing to talk, it could break his whole system." Back at the church, Pastor Emmanuel sat in his dimly lit office. A loyal follower, Brother Matthew, stood before him, his hands clasped nervously. "They're not giving up," Matthew said. "That woman, she's still meeting with people." Pastor Emmanuel's eyes narrowed. "This woman, what do you know about her?" "She's been asking questions, meeting with girls who stopped coming to church. People are starting to talk." The pastor leaned back in his chair, his face calm but his eyes cold. "If she wants to play games, let's see how far she's willing to go. Follow her. Find out who she's working with." Matthew nodded quickly. "Yes, Pastor." As Matthew left, Pastor Emmanuel picked up his phone and made another call. "It's time we remind everyone who's in charge," he said quietly. A few days later, Grace and John noticed something unusual. Everywhere they went, the market, the street corner, even the quiet park where Grace sometimes sat, there seemed to be someone watching. John spotted a man sitting in a parked car outside their building one morning. When their eyes met, the man quickly drove off. "He's closing in," John said that evening as they locked the doors and windows. Amaka, who had been spending more time with them to strategize, nodded grimly. "It's intimidation. He wants to scare you into silence, but we won't let him." Grace hugged herself tightly. "What if he tries to hurt us?" "I won't let that happen," Amaka said. She opened her bag and pulled out a small recording device. "From now on, we document everything. If anyone approaches you record them. If they follow you, take pictures. The more we have, the better. Amaka received a tip from one of the victims she'd interviewed. There was someone in Pastor Emmanuel's inner circle who might be willing to talk. It was a woman named Sister Beatrice, a long-time member of the church who had grown disillusioned with the pastor but was too afraid to leave. Amaka arranged to meet Sister Beatrice in secret at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Grace insisted on coming along, despite John's protest. "I need to do this," Grace said firmly. The meeting was tense. Sister Beatrice arrived wearing a scarf and sunglasses, her hands shaking as she sat down. "If he finds out I'm talking to you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He won't," Amaka assured her. "We'll protect you, but we need your help." Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. "I know things that could destroy him. But if I talk, I need to know it'll make a difference." "It will," Grace said, her voice steady. "We'll make sure of it." Sister Beatrice sat with her hands folded tightly on the table, her knuckles white from the pressure. Her voice trembled as she began to speak. "Pastor Emmanuel isn't what he seems," she said quietly. "For years I've watched him manipulate people, especially the young girls. He uses his power to silence them, to control their families, and those who try to resist, they pay the price." Grace leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What do you mean? What kind of price?" Beatrice swallowed hard, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be listening. "There was a family once, a man who tried to expose him. Pastor Emmanuel destroyed him. He had people spread lies about the man's wife, saying she was unfaithful. He called it God's punishment for turning against his chosen servant." Amaka nodded. "I've heard similar stories, but we need more. Something solid, something undeniable. Do you have any proof?" Beatrice hesitated, then lowered her voice even further. "He keeps records, everything, payments, names, details about the families he targets. He says it's for prayer purposes, but I've seen the files. He keeps them locked in a cabinet in his office at the church." Amaka's eyes lit up. "If we can get those files, it's over for him." Grace's heart raced. "But how will you get them? He'll never let you near that cabinet." Amaka sat back, her mind working quickly. "I'll find a way. If those files exist, they're the key to bringing him down." Back at the church, Pastor Emmanuel's patience was running thin. Reports from Brother Matthew and Sister Deborah confirmed his suspicions. Someone was digging too deeply. He paced his office, his movements sharp and agitated. "They think they can challenge me. They think they can ruin everything I've built." Sister Deborah shifted nervously in her seat. "What do you want us to do, Pastor?" "Watch them all," he snapped. "The families, the girls, anyone who might turn against me. And find that woman, Amaka. She's the one stirring this up." Deborah nodded. "Yes, Pastor. We'll handle it." Pastor Emmanuel sat down, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, but his calm facade was cracking. He could feel the walls closing in. That night, Amaka called Grace and John to share her plan. "We need to get into his office," she said. "Those files are the final piece of the puzzle." John frowned. "You're talking about breaking into the church? That's insane." "It's risky, yes," Amaka admitted. "But if we don't act now, he'll keep getting away with it. Every day we wait, more girls are at risk." Grace looked at John, her expression filled with determination. "She's right. We've come this far. We can't stop now." John sighed heavily. "If something happens to you, Grace..." "I'll be fine," Grace said firmly. "We have to do this, for Ada." Late that night, Amaka and Grace made their way to the church. The building was quiet, the lights dimmed. Amaka had a plan to distract the security guard while Grace slipped into the pastor's office. As Grace entered the office, her heart pounded in her chest. The room was dark, the shadows stretching across the walls. She spotted the cabinet in the corner, just as Beatrice had described. She approached it slowly, her hands trembling as she pulled on the handle. Locked. "Amaka?" she whispered into the small earpiece they were using. "It's locked." "Check the desk," Amaka whispered back. "He might have a key there." Grace began searching the desk drawers, her fingers moving quickly. Suddenly, a noise outside the door made her freeze. Footsteps. "Someone's coming," she whispered. "Stay calm," Amaka said. "Hide if you have to, but don't leave without those files." Grace ducked behind the desk, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. The door handle turned. Ada's life ended in pain after Pastor Emmanuel used his power to control her. She trusted him for help, but instead, he hurt her in silence. Her parents, Grace and John, didn't know what was happening. When Ada got pregnant, Pastor Emmanuel gave her a dangerous drink, which took her life. Grace later found Ada's secret notes and learned the truth about Pastor Emmanuel. Despite their anger, Grace and John were too scared to speak out because of his power. The pastor continued to harm other girls, but some people began to speak up. In part 2, Grace and John fight their fear and guilt, trying to gather secrets about the pastor to stop him. Grace stood outside the pastor's office, her heart pounding. The file she had stolen was in her hand, and it felt heavy, like it could break her at any moment. She knew that this information could end everything. Pastor Emmanuel's reign, his lies, his cruelty. She took a deep breath. It wasn't over yet. The church was empty now. The members had gone home after a long service, and this was her chance. But what if someone saw her? What if Pastor Emmanuel found out? The fear gnawed at her, but she kept her focus. The file had everything, his secrets, his lies, the names of the girls he had hurt. Grace had to act fast. She looked around one last time. Then she slowly made her way out of the pastor's office and into the dark hallway. Every step felt like it could be her last. Outside, the night air was cool, but Grace felt nothing. Her mind was racing, her thoughts spinning. "I have to get this to the right people," she whispered to herself. She took the file and hurried to her car. It felt like the world was closing in around her. The pastor had to be stopped. She couldn't let him keep doing this. At home, Grace called John. "I got it," she said, her voice shaky. "You did?" John's voice sounded tired but relieved. "I knew you could. Now, we have to be careful." Grace sat down, staring at the file in her hands. "This could be the end, John. We can't go back now." John didn't answer right away. The silence felt heavy between them. "We have to do it for Ada," he finally said, "for all the girls he's hurt." Grace nodded. She knew that John was right. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. The next day, Grace and John met Amaka. Amaka had been the one to reach out to them first. She was the one brave enough to start gathering the other victims. Together, they went through the file, piece by piece. It was like reading a nightmare, but it was the truth. Amaka's face tightened as she read through the names. "We need to show this to the world," she said. "The truth can't stay hidden anymore." Grace looked up at Amaka. "But how? He has too much power. The church trusts him. The community follows him. He can't be stopped easily." "We have to be strong," Amaka replied. "If we don't stand up now, no one else will." Grace nodded. It wasn't just for Ada anymore. It was for every girl Pastor Emmanuel had hurt, every person who had been lied to, every family that had trusted him. They spent the next few days preparing, but their fear was growing. Pastor Emmanuel wasn't just a man of the church. He was a man of power, and he would do anything to protect it. Meanwhile, the pastor grew more paranoid. His usual calm facade was slipping. He could feel the walls closing in, though he didn't know who was behind it. One evening, while Grace and John were going over their plans, Amaka burst through the door. "It's happening," she said, her voice frantic. "Someone saw me talking to the other victims. They know I've been reaching out to people. He's already looking for me." Grace froze. "He knows." "I don't know how, but he does," Amaka said, her eyes wide. "He's not going to stop until he finds out who's been leaking information." They all stared at each other. There was no more time for fear. It was now or never. "We have to do it," Grace said firmly. "We have to expose him. We can't let him hurt anyone else." One evening, as Grace and John sat in their small apartment, trying to plan their next move, Amaka's phone rang. They all turned toward the sound. Grace answered, but there was nothing but silence on the other end. She called Amaka's name, but no answer came. "Maybe she's busy," John said, trying to stay calm. But his voice trembled. They both knew that something felt wrong. The hours passed, and still, there was no word from Amaka. Grace called her again, but it went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in. "Where could she be?" Grace whispered, her heart sinking. John stood up and paced around the room. "This isn't right. She would never just disappear without telling us." His hands clenched into fists. "It's him, isn't it? Pastor Emmanuel has done something to her." Grace looked at John, her eyes filled with fear. She couldn't deny it. They knew how dangerous Pastor Emmanuel was. He had power, money, and influence, and he wasn't going to let anyone expose him. The next morning, Grace and John drove around the town, asking anyone if they had seen Amaka. No one had any information. Days passed, and the tension grew. They had no answers, and no way to find Amaka. Then one morning, they got the call. It was the police. "Grace, John, you need to come down to the highway," the officer said. "We found a body." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Grace's heart raced in her chest, but she had to ask, "Is it Amaka?" There was a long pause before the officer spoke again. "Yes, I'm afraid so." Grace dropped the phone, feeling like the ground had just been pulled out from under her. John quickly picked it up and started the car. They didn't speak the whole drive. What could they say? What was left to say? When they arrived at the highway, they were led to Amaka's body. It was a silent scene. No one spoke. The police had already covered her body, but there was no mistaking it was her. The life had been taken from her, and Grace felt a deep emptiness in her chest. This wasn't just a loss of a friend. It was the death of the hope that had kept them fighting. "We have to stop him, John," Grace whispered, tears falling down her cheeks. "We can't let her death be in vain." John nodded, his face grim. He was angry. He had lost so much, but this was too much. "We will. We have to finish what she started." Pastor Emmanuel sat in his office, unaware of what was happening. His phone rang, and it wasn't the usual calls. It was one of the men he had paid to do his dirty work. "Pastor," the man's voice sounded angry. "We have a problem." Pastor Emmanuel frowned. "What do you mean?" "We did the job, but it wasn't easy. The girl didn't go down like the others. She fought back. We had more trouble than we thought. We want more money." Pastor Emmanuel stood up, angry. "I paid you what I promised. That's enough. You do what I ask." The man didn't back down. "That's not good enough. We worked harder than we expected. You owe us more." Pastor Emmanuel clenched his fists. "I don't care what you think. You've got your money." The man's voice was cold. "You have 3 days to pay us more, or we'll deal with you. Don't make us angry, Pastor." Pastor Emmanuel felt a cold sweat on his face. "Fine, I'll get the money, but don't try to come after me." "We'll see," the man said. 3 days. The line went dead. Pastor Emmanuel stood still, his mind racing. This was getting out of control. Everyone was coming for him. Pastor Emmanuel's life had become a shadow of what it once was. The weight of his secrets was too much to carry, and it began to show. Every time he stood in front of his congregation, he felt exposed. He had lost the strong, confident presence that had once made everyone believe in him. His hands would shake as he held the microphone, and his words were no longer as powerful as before. The prayers he used to speak with boldness now seemed forced, as if the fear he felt inside was creeping into every word. As the weeks went by, his mind was consumed by the mounting pressure. The threats from the men he had hired to silence Amaka kept echoing in his ears. The fear of being exposed haunted him. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, gnawing at him every day. He knew someone was coming for him. He tried to ignore it, tried to carry on as if everything was fine. But the whispers in the church started to grow louder. The congregation, once full of blind faith, now seemed to question his every move. They noticed his lack of boldness, his hesitation. Some began to talk. Pastor Emmanuel could feel the tension rising, but he didn't know where it was coming from. Inside the church, as he gave his sermons, his mind was far from the words he was saying. His eyes would wander over the crowd, scanning each face. Was there someone in the congregation who knew? Someone who could expose him? The thought sent chills down his spine. He tried to keep his composure, but the fear was almost suffocating. On the other side, Grace and John were working tirelessly, but they knew it wasn't going to be easy. The evidence they had collected was enough to ruin Pastor Emmanuel. But who could they trust? Corruption was everywhere. They knew the judicial system wasn't reliable. There were too many people who could be bought, too many who would turn a blind eye. They couldn't risk handing over the evidence to just anyone. "We have to be careful," Grace said, pacing the small apartment. "We can't just take this to any police officer. Some of them are in his pocket. What if they leak it to him before we can do anything?" John's face was tight with concern. "You're right. We can't trust anyone. But we can't sit on this forever either. He's getting more powerful. We need to act." They both knew they couldn't waste any more time, but their options were limited. They thought about the media, but then the same fear crept in. What if he has connections there too? Grace wondered aloud. We could end up in the same situation. John looked out the window, his mind working fast. What if we find someone outside of the system? Someone who doesn't have the same fear of him? We could go to the press or a journalist who's willing to listen. "I don't know, John," Grace replied. "I just don't want to risk everything and then find out it wasn't enough. We could lose our chance." They sat in silence, both thinking hard. They knew there was no turning back now. They had to take their next step carefully. But while Grace and John were planning their next move, the men who had been hired by Pastor Emmanuel were making their own plans. They were furious that they hadn't been paid the extra money they demanded for Amaka's death. She had not been an easy target. She had fought back. It had taken more effort than they had expected. They felt they deserved more than what Pastor Emmanuel had given them. They had been patient, waiting for the pastor to pay up. But now they were done waiting. "We've waited long enough," one of the men growled. "The pastor thinks he can ignore us, but we'll make sure he knows we mean business." "I told him we needed more," another man added, his voice full of anger. "He can't just treat us like this. We've done the job, and we want what we're owed. If he thinks we'll just walk away, he's wrong." The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar on his face, slammed his fist on the table. "He gave us the first payment, but he promised more. We're going to make him pay. We've done our part, and now he's going to pay for his mistake." They agreed to give Pastor Emmanuel a 3-day ultimatum. If he didn't pay up, they would make sure he paid in another way. "We won't just let him go," the leader said, his voice cold. "We'll make him regret ever crossing us. He'll learn the hard way." The men left the room, their plans set in motion. They were angry, and they were not going to back down. They were going to make sure Pastor Emmanuel knew exactly what would happen if he didn't keep his word. As all of this unfolded, the tension between Grace, John, and the pastor grew stronger. Both sides were planning, and both sides were running out of time. The stakes were higher than ever, and the closer it got to the deadline, the more dangerous things would become. They were all heading toward the same goal, exposing Pastor Emmanuel for what he truly was. The walls were closing in on him, and there was nowhere left to hide. Pastor Emmanuel's refusal to pay the men only made things worse. The men were furious, and they were not going to let him get away with it. They had been patient, but their patience had run out. They knew Pastor Emmanuel had to be exposed, and they had the perfect way to do it. Using anonymous profiles, they uploaded recordings to social media. The recordings were clear and damning, Pastor Emmanuel's own voice, making deals with the men, agreeing to pay them for doing his dirty work. The recordings showed him telling them how to handle people who might try to expose his secrets, including giving them instructions on how to take out those who were in his way. The posts were shared widely. Bloggers, activists, and social media influencers picked up on it. They shared the videos, calling for justice. The recordings went viral in a matter of hours, and soon, Pastor Emmanuel was the center of a public storm. People began to dig deeper into his past. Old rumors resurfaced. The community, the church, and even the media were all calling for him to explain himself. Pastor Emmanuel's phone rang non-stop. Messages flooded in. Some people, once loyal to him, now questioned his actions. They demanded answers. Social media was flooded with angry posts, hashtags, and calls for Pastor Emmanuel to clear his name. People were speaking out, sharing their own stories, and urging others to join the movement. At first, Pastor Emmanuel tried to deny it. He called the recordings fake, claimed they were taken out of context, and tried to convince his followers that someone was trying to ruin his reputation. But the evidence was too strong. The more he denied it, the more people began to doubt him. He started to lose control. The church, once a place of peace and comfort for him, now felt like a cage. He couldn't even look anyone in the eye. The pressure was too much. The pastors and leaders he had once worked with now turned their backs on him. His reputation was crumbling, and with every new post on social media, it seemed like his world was falling apart. The congregation became divided. Some people still believed in him, clinging to his lies, but many more began to question everything he had told them. The church started to empty out as the truth spread, and Pastor Emmanuel's supporters grew fewer and fewer. On the outside, he remained defiant, still trying to play the role of a man of God. But on the inside, he was breaking. His mind raced with panic. He couldn't go back. He had done too much to cover up, and now it was all coming to light. Soon, the authorities became involved. The leaked recordings were enough to start an investigation, and the pressure on Pastor Emmanuel only grew. It wasn't just about his reputation anymore. It was about his freedom. The truth was finally catching up with him, and there was no way to run from it. People called for justice. They wanted to know the truth about how many lives Pastor Emmanuel had destroyed, how many people had suffered because of him. And there were even whispers that this might be just the beginning. More secrets were waiting to be uncovered. Pastor Emmanuel's world was spiraling out of control. The more he denied it, the more people demanded answers. But the one thing he didn't know yet was that the truth was coming for him, and it was unstoppable. The news spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the city. Grace and John couldn't believe their eyes when they saw the viral posts and videos online. It was happening. Pastor Emmanuel's secret was out, and there was no turning back. For days, Grace and John had been sitting quietly, afraid to act, but now they saw the power of truth unfolding before them. They knew it was time. The world was demanding answers, and they had everything they needed to expose Pastor Emmanuel for the monster he was. John turned to Grace. "This is it. We can't wait any longer." Grace nodded. Her hands trembled, but there was fire in her eyes now. She had lived with the pain of losing Ada for so long, and now it was time to make sure her daughter's death wasn't in vain. She grabbed the folder of evidence they had been holding on to for so long, the photos, the recordings, the testimonies, and held it tight. "We have to go to someone who can get this to the world," Grace said. "Someone who can make sure it's heard by everyone." John agreed. "We'll go to the biggest activist, the one with the power to get this on every screen, every news station." They quickly packed the evidence, made phone calls, and arranged a meeting with one of the most well-known activists in the city, a person who had fought for justice for many others and had a huge following. They knew this was the only way to get the message to the masses. When they met the activist, Grace spoke first. "We have proof of everything Pastor Emmanuel has done, the lives he's ruined, the people he's hurt. We want to make sure he's held accountable." The activist listened carefully, his eyes scanning the evidence. "This is huge," he said after a moment. "This will expose him for everything he is. But we have to make sure we're careful. If we do this right, it will be impossible for him to deny." They handed over all the evidence, and the activists made sure everything was recorded and ready to go. The world would soon know the truth about Pastor Emmanuel and the horror he had caused. As the activists sat in front of the cameras, ready to broadcast the story, Grace and John sat nervously in the background, waiting for the world to hear their daughter's story. The activist began to speak, his voice calm but full of anger at the injustice. "This is the story of a man who used his position of power to manipulate, control, and abuse. Pastor Emmanuel, once seen as a man of God, has used his influence to hurt countless people, including a young girl named Ada. Her parents, Grace and John, are here to share their story and to make sure no one else falls victim to his lies." The camera cut to Grace and John, sitting side by side. Grace's heart was pounding, but she felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, the truth was out. They told their story, how they had trusted Pastor Emmanuel, how they had sent their daughter to him for help, and how he had manipulated her. They spoke about the death of their daughter, about the pain and the guilt they had carried for so long, and they shared the evidence they had gathered. The room went silent as the recordings played. Pastor Emmanuel's voice echoed through the speakers, giving instructions on how to silence those who dared to speak out against him. The video of him making deals with the men he had hired to take out his enemies played next. There was no denying it. The truth was clear for everyone to see. The broadcast went viral instantly. Social media exploded with reactions. People were shocked, disgusted, and outraged. The hashtag #expose Pastor Emmanuel began trending, and soon, more victims came forward, sharing their stories. The media picked up the story, and news outlets around the world covered the scandal. Pastor Emmanuel's world collapsed in front of him. The backlash was unlike anything he had ever faced. His phone was flooded with messages. Some of his loyal followers turned against him, while others defended him. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. Pastor Emmanuel tried to deny everything, but it was too late. The recordings, the testimonies, the evidence, it was all too much. Law enforcement stepped in, and an investigation began. Soon, Pastor Emmanuel was arrested. His power, once untouchable, was gone. As the news spread of his arrest, Grace and John felt a weight lift off their shoulders. Pastor Emmanuel was finally being held accountable for the lives he had destroyed. They had done what they set out to do, not just for Ada, but for every person he had hurt. The fight wasn't over, but it was a victory. The activist who had helped them was hailed as a hero. The world had heard their story, and change was finally starting to happen. Pastor Emmanuel would stand trial for his crimes, and there was no escape for him anymore. In the end, Grace and John knew that justice had been served, and Ada's death had not been in vain. They had fought for her, and now the world would know the truth. The story had come to an end, but it had left behind a legacy, a reminder that no matter how much power someone holds, the truth will always find a way to come to light. And Pastor Emmanuel would face the consequences of his actions. He could no longer hide behind his lies.